Welcome back to the Fit CEO podcast by Chad Molyneux. Hope you guys are doing amazing. I hope you guys had a fantastic weekend. This past weekend, Caitlin and I went to Ooby Dooby, which is a music festival, our first music festival of 2021, our first music festival since February of 2020, which was the month literally right before coronavirus. It's actually really crazy. It was called Thunderdome in Seattle. And this was February of 2020. And like the first US case of coronavirus was actually in Seattle at the time. And I can remember Caitlin packed like masks and whatnot. And I thought nothing of it. I was like, oh, this will just blow over. It's nothing. And then obviously a month later, we're in shutdown. And then, the whole entire 2020. And here we are. So it was really awesome to be able to go back to a music festival. It's something that me and Caitlin love to do. We're not partiers, but we definitely do like going and enjoying some music with friends. Anyways, that was my little spiel. That's what I did this weekend. But what we're going to be talking about today is we're going to be talking about targets, okay? And this is going to be one of those really practical podcasts. It's going to be one of those podcasts that you're definitely going to want notes. You're definitely going to want something to write with, because I'm going to be breaking down step by step how to set targets for sales, for projects, for hires, for what to focus on in your business. And this is literally the same exact thing that we teach our Next Level Coaching Academy students. It's also the same exact process that I implement. Everything that we teach, and this is like one of my favorite parts about the Next Level Coaching Academy, everything that we teach in NLCA is exactly what me and Dayla do. Like there's no theory in there. Like it's like, hey, this is what we've done to build really successful coaching businesses, and that's what we're going to put in the course. And if we haven't done it, you're not going to see it in the course, because why would I teach something that I haven't done, right? But if you're watching this on YouTube, I'm actually going to eventually share my screen. I'm going to show you guys the course, and I'm going to show you guys the module where we break down how to break down all of these targets, right? So if you're listening, break out a notebook, have something to write with. If you're watching on YouTube, you'll be able to actually see my screen. All right, so why targets, right? Why are targets so important? When our students are trying to go from, $10,000 a month plus, right? Once somebody gets up to $10,000 a month, what gets somebody to $10,000 a month is, systems and, working really hard and grit. But once you hit $10,000 a month, there's a different layer to it. And what that different layer is being able to have a vision of where you're going, right? If you want to start having 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 and above, 100 and above, if you want to start making that kind of money, you have to know where you're going, right? Which means that you have to have a process around setting targets for what's important in your business, right? So when I made this change in my business, this is when I started having really much bigger months. And once again, this is when our clients started having really bigger months. So it's really, really important that you have the understanding of what to set targets on and how exactly to set targets. All right. So that leads me perfectly into the next step. What should you set targets on? You should set targets on sales, meaning certain metrics, and we're going to go over all those metrics on this podcast. You should set targets on projects, like what projects are going to move the business forward, because a ton of people focus on projects, but they're not the right projects. They're not the projects that are actually going to move the business forward, right? Number 3 is hires. What hires need to be made and when do they need to be made, right? So that's a target. And then lastly is the focus. The focus of the CEO, right? The focus of the leader, the focus of the man or woman in charge that is saying, hey, to the company, hey, this is what we need to focus on. And if you're a one woman or one man team, it's the same thing. You need to identify what you want to focus on. And there's 5 different areas of business that we teach in the Next Level Coaching Academy that you need to focus on. And what those are lead generation, show up rate, which means, lead generation is booking calls, right? And then show up rate is the rate at which those calls show up, right? Are you getting cancellations? Are you getting reschedules, or are they showing? Number 3 is closing percentage. So how many of those calls that show actually close? Number 4 is client delivery. So what is the success of your clients, right? And then number 5 is client retention, right? How many of those clients buy a second, third, fourth, fifth time, right? So those are the different areas of business that you could focus on. But when setting targets, you need to identify, all right, what are the challenges in the business? Okay, we need to focus on X, Y, Z, or whatever it may be, right? You're not always focusing on all 5. To some degree, you may be, but you want to identify which of those 5 you want to have the primary focus on, okay? So let's start with breaking down your sales targets, okay? And in order to break down your sales targets, you need to have a good understanding of your sales system. And we teach this in the Next Level Coaching Academy as well. The 2 sales systems that we teach is a 1-call close and a 2-call close. And not to get too much into detail, but long story short, what that means is 1 call means you book in 1 call. That's the call that you're going to try to close the individual. You're going to present your program. You're going to talk pricing, and you're going to try to make them a client on that call. 2-call close is a 2-step process. It's an initial call where it's kind of like, we call it a meet and greet call, right? You're meeting, you're hanging out, you're seeing if it's a good fit, you're vibing. If you're vibing, you're going to book in a 2nd call. If you're not vibing, you're not going to book in a 2nd call. And then on that 2nd call is when you're going to present your program, pricing, and seeing if they're a good fit. Okay. So for the purpose of this video and this podcast, and I'm sharing my screen now for those watching on the video, we are going to break down 1-call closes. Okay. So for a 1-call close, and if you guys are viewing my screen, this is going to be the formula. All right. So if you are listening on the podcast, now would be the time that you want to break out that pen and paper. Okay. So how to create these targets for a 1-call close. The first thing that you're going to want to identify, and we're going to work backwards from here, is you want to identify your desired yearly revenue. So for simplicity's sake, for the purpose of this podcast, for the purpose of this video, we're going to say $100,000. Okay. So once you have that identified, once you say, hey, this is my desired yearly revenue, now we need to work backwards, right? So we need to figure out how many clients we need in order to achieve this revenue. So what you're going to do, really simple math equation, is you're going to take that total desired revenue and you're going to divide it by your average cost of package sold. So this is why I'm such a huge advocate of knowing all your data, because you can come up with these numbers, right? So what you're going to do is you're going to look through the packages that you've sold, and then you're going to come up with the average cost of packages sold. If you know right off the top of your head that you always close the 3-month, this is the one that we always close, then great, that's the number you're going to use, right? So whatever number, whatever price point of the most popular package that you have that is sold is the one that you're going to use for this equation, right? Okay, so now getting back to the math. You're going to take your desired revenue, you're going to divide it by the average cost of packages sold, right? So for the simplicity's sake, we'll say that your desired yearly revenue is $100,000. We'll say that your average package sold is $1,000. Therefore, you need 100 clients, right? So that's how we work backwards to figure out how many clients we need in order to hit our yearly revenue. So I'm going to say that one more time. Your yearly revenue desired is 100,000. The average cost of your package is $1,000. Therefore, you need 100 clients in order to make $100,000. Super simple, right? Okay, cool. So the next thing that you need to understand is your closing calls show up rate, right? So you need to figure out what your show up rate is, or what that target show up rate is, right? So what you're going to do is you're going to take your closing percentage and you're going to multiply it until it hits your client's needed number. Okay. So takes a little bit of guesswork here, but let's say that your average closing percentage is 70%, right? And the number that we're trying to get to is we're trying to get to 100 clients, right? Because 100 clients is what we need to make $100,000, right? So what we're trying to figure out now is how many closing calls have to show, like how many calls do you have to actually get to show in order to close 100 clients, right? So how do we do that? Well, if you know that your closing percentage is 70%, then you're going to start plugging in random numbers, multiplying it by 70% until you hit 100 clients, right? So just for the purpose of this video, let's start with 200, right? So 200 times 0.7, which is our closing percentage, gets us to 140, which means that if we closed 70% of 200 calls that showed, we would make 140 clients, right? but that's not our target. Our target is 100 clients, right? Because we just figured out that number. So knowing that 200 gets us 140, we're going to dip down a little bit. I'm just going to jump to the correct number, which is 144 times 0.7 equals 100, right? So now we know that we need to get 144 calls to show with a 70% closing percentage in order for us to get 100 clients. And if we get 100 clients and we sell those 100 clients on average at $1,000, then we're going to make $100,000 within the year. See, really simple math. So moving along here, right? Because now we know how many calls need to show in order for us to get 100 clients, but now we need to know how many calls need to be booked in order to reach 144 calls shown, right? Because not every call is going to show. So now what we need to do is we need to determine what our show up rate is, right? And actually really quick before we move forward, if you guys have no idea what your closing percentage is, just take your best educated guess. Maybe it's 50%, maybe it's 30%, maybe it's 80%, whatever you think it is. But this is also a really good time to say, wow, I should probably start tracking these metrics so I know for certain what this stuff is, right? And maybe that's your biggest takeaway of this podcast, is that you need to start tracking your data. Okay, so now moving forward, we've figured out, and just kind of backtracking because I know this is a lot, we figured out what our yearly desired revenue is. We figured out how many clients we need in order to reach that. We figured out how many calls we need to get to show up, actually show up on the call in order to reach that 100 clients that we need. And now we need to figure out how many calls we need to book in order to achieve 144 calls shown. Okay, so the metric that we need to know here is our show up rate. And like I said, if you don't know what your show up rate is, take your best educated guess. Show up rate is how many of the calls that you book actually physically show up on the call. All right, so for the purposes of this video, for the purposes of this podcast, we're going to say 70%. Okay, so it's the same thing. You're going to plug in random numbers times 0.7 until you equal out to 144, because 144 is the amount of calls shown. So let's start with 250. 250 times a 70% show up rate gets us to 175, right? Now I'm going to give you the right number. 206 times 0.7 gets us 144. So now we know that we need to book 206 calls. We need to have at least a 70% show up rate in order to get 144 calls to show, right? So now we have all the data. We know how many calls we need to book. We know how many of those calls need to show. We know how many of those calls need to close in order to reach $100,000. Boom, there we go. And you know what? I'm actually going to be a nice guy. Kyle, in the show notes, and don't cut this out, but in the show notes, if we can, I'm going to send you a target setting worksheet. If we can put this in the show notes, and for those listening, if you want all these equations, I'm just going to put it in the show notes for you, because I'm realizing that it may be a lot to follow along with. Okay, so now you have all the information, right? Now you know exactly how many calls you need to book to get a certain amount of calls to show, to get a certain amount of calls to close in order to, make the amount of money that you want to make. Okay, so if you want to break that down, right, because this is yearly, right? Now we have the yearly numbers. If you want to break that down, if you want to break that down monthly, really simple, you divide it by 12. If you want to break it down weekly, really simple, divide it by 52, because there's 52 weeks, right? And if you want to know quarterly, really simple, break it down by 4, right? Because there's 4 quarters in the month. Okay, so there's some other aspects to target setting for sales. I'm not going to get too in depth. Like I said, that resource will be down below. But what I'm going to get into now is hires, projects, and focuses, and how to determine this. All right, so give me 1 sec as I pull this up for the people watching on the video. One second. Okay, cool. So this is the sheet that we provide our students. I'm not going to provide you this one, but if you're watching on the video, you'll be able to see. Okay, so this one's a little more simple. It's easier to follow along. There's no math involved, thank God, but super, super helpful. And this is how I view business, right? So you're probably asking, all right, what am I getting out of this podcast? What are the nuggets, right? The real nugget in this podcast is understanding how I think and how I plan and what I plan around, right? So we just did that from a sales context. I just told you what the most important metrics are, right? They're calls booked, calls shown, calls closed, how many clients we need, and then also revenue, like what we want to achieve, right? Now, from a different perspective, I'm going to talk about projects, hires, and focuses, right? So these are the things I'm also focusing on outside of just sales, okay? So starting from a hiring perspective, and like I said, you really have to be able to visualize where your business is going if you want to get past $10,000 a month. And one of those aspects is hiring, right? So visualize your business, think out and think, okay, cool. What is the team that I want to build within the next 12 months? How many assistant coaches do I want? How many DMers am I going to need, right? How many salespeople am I going to need to take my sales calls? How many VAs am I going to need? And maybe I'll go into this in a different podcast, but we actually give you those formulas as well in the Next Level Coaching Academy. We actually say, hey, this is the formula to identify how many assistant coaches you're going to need over the year. I'm not going to get into that, but just start thinking about it, right? Start thinking about, okay, cool. What are the certain hires that I need to make over the year? And then you're going to write down those hires. The way that I like to do this is I like to say, okay, for each of those departments, what's the total team number that I want, right? At the beginning of the year, I said, I want 10 DMers, right? We want X amount of coaches. We want X amount of salespeople. And when you're thinking about the more sales position roles, right? DM outreach, you're thinking about also closing calls. I'll give you a little insight on how to figure out the math, but it's all going to be predicated around the target for calls booked and how many calls you're expecting to show, right? Because if you estimate that one closer can take 20 calls a week and you want to have 1,000 calls out over the year, then you can work out the math that way, right? And if you want to book 2,000 calls and each DMer books, 30, 40 calls a week, you can do out the math on how many DMers you'll need, right? So there's a little insight, but you guys will have to do the work, right? So, all right, I think I've talked enough about the hires, right? You have to identify how many assistant coaches, how many VAs, how many DMers, how many salespeople. I'm not sure where you're at in business, but sometimes, if you're further along in business and you're listening to this, you're going to have to hire management as well, right? So we have different managers in different departments, but I won't get too deep into that. Okay. So the next thing that you'll have to identify is projects, right? And projects that are going to move the business forward. And there's a big asterisk on that. And the reason there's a big asterisk on that is because a lot of people will identify projects, but those projects aren't actually moving the business forward, right? It's like, I'm going to make my logo prettier. Like, no, that's not a project that's going to move the business forward, right? And really, to identify projects, it comes down to the focuses that we were talking about, right? The projects should be centered around lead generation, show up rate, closing rate, client delivery, and client retention. So to give you an example, one of the big projects that we worked on this year for Next Level Coaching Academy is our client retention system. We've refined it. We tested different things. Oh, Caitlin's going to come in. Hold on, Kyle. I'm going to pause this really quick. Hold on, I'm mid-podcast.
What?
I'm mid-podcast.
Oh, is this recording?
I put it on pause. Okay, and we're back. Apologize about that. Caitlin walked in from the gym, but I like to keep these real and raw. So, there are slip ups, nothing's perfect. Anyways, getting back to what I was talking about before, projects, you want to create your projects around the main areas of business that we talked about before, right? And for us, one of the big projects that NLCA was focused on this year was improving our retention system. So, we tweaked a bunch of different things. We tested things. We had to revamp it like 2 or 3 times in order for us to actually find something that worked. It actually ended up being about a 4 to 5 month project, right? So when you're thinking about the projects that are going to move the business forward, they should be linked to one or more more than one of lead generation, show up rate, closing rate, client delivery, and client retention. Another one, like another example that I can give you from our students is the inclusion of ads, right? So ads would be associated to lead generation. You could say to some degree it's associated to show up rate and closing rate, right? But it's really associated with lead generation. But that would be a project over the course of a year that you would have to continue to tweak and improve, right? So now that you understand how to create projects, projects are all going to be based around those 5 things. Then you would create your year's worth of projects that you feel will move those areas forward in your business. Okay. And then lastly, it's the focuses. So as we talked about, the focuses are lead generation, show up rate, close rate, client delivery, and client retention. So when I'm identifying focuses, here's what I do. I write out all of those 5. I write out lead generation, show up rate, closing rate, client delivery, and client retention. And then I break down each of those 5 into 3 categories. And what those 3 categories are skill, system, and person. So in my mind, I go, okay, cool. We're struggling with lead generation. Is the issue a skill that I or our team is missing? Is it a system or process? Like, is our process, not working? Is there something in the process that needs to be fixed? Or is it a person? And when I'm talking about person, I'm talking about a member of the team, right? So if you have a team, it's a member of your team. If you don't have team members, then that won't pertain to you. But really, when you're identifying a challenge in each of these 5 areas, lead generation, show up rate, close rate, client delivery, and client retention, you're going to break it down into 3 things. Is it a skill that I or the team is missing? Is the system messed up and the process needs to be changed? Or is the person that we need to hire? Do we need to bring on more people? Or do we need to let somebody go, right? So what I do at the beginning of the year is I break down the different skills, systems, and people that we'll need for each of those 5 focuses, okay? So at this point, you should have a year's worth of hires, projects, and how you want to shape up each of those 5 focuses over the course of a year, all right? Then really simply, what you're going to do is you're going to break that down quarterly. So you'll take those hires, projects, and focuses and break them down quarterly on what you want to focus on and when. Then you'll break it down monthly, right? So for quarter 1, you'll break it down into those 3 months, January, February, March. And then you'll break it down weekly. So for me, every week on Saturday or Sunday, I'll look at the projects, hires, and focuses for the month, and then I'll identify what my tasks are for the week. That's also how I identify my tasks for the day. So what I'll do is I'll look at my week and I'll say, okay, cool, I'm going to work on this, 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 and this today, right? And it's all predicated around the hires, projects, and focuses that I've laid out for the year, the quarter, the month, the week, all the way down to the day. So I hope this was helpful for you. Let me look at my notes really quick and make sure that I went through everything. And I did. So I hope you guys found this helpful. I would recommend going back and listening to this one a few times. It's a little more complex. It's definitely a little more high level than I've thrown at you before, but I think you guys are good for it. I think you guys can take some high level stuff. But if it was too high level for you, really the big things that you should have taken away from this is you have to know your targets and you have to be tracking your data. Because if you don't know where you're going, if you don't know where your targets are, and you don't know where you're at currently, it's going to be very, very, very hard for you to identify what needs to change in the business and what projects, hires, and focuses you need to focus on in order to get where you want to go. But anyways, that's everything that I have. If you guys enjoyed this, please tag me up on an Instagram story. You can just take a screenshot, tag me up. I do appreciate that. It lets me know that you guys are liking it. Lets me know that you guys are listening. But anyways, thank you guys so much, and we will chat soon. Peace.